Compared to historic courtroom dramas of our national past, Northern Michigan's trial of the century is quite a contender, containing all the unsavory elements of murder, sex scandal, grave desecration, and torture. Add in a missing person, a church cover-up, and a police mole, and it's easy to see why this case constituted a closet full of very sensitive skeletons. It was October 1919, professional baseball's darkest hour, and while down in Chicago, the White Sox were fixing the World Series, the tiny coastal town of Leland suddenly appeared in the national spotlight as a small Polish housekeeper stood trial for the murder of the missing nun. More than a decade had passed since the summer of 1907, when Sister Mary Johns disappeared. She had come to Northern Michigan from Detroit to teach at the convent school in Isadore, now a ghost town in the center of Leelanau County.
Set in the southeast corner of Section 29, the Isadore area was home to some 150 families of fairly wealthy Polish farmers. The Leelanau County land was then selling for only $25 to $35 an acre, with uncultivated wild land costing even less. The primary crops were potatoes, rye, oats, beans, corn, and peas. On August 23rd, upon his return from a fishing trip with the choir boy, the pastor of the Isadore Church learned of the disappearance of Sister Mary Johns. He sent for the sheriff of Antrim County and his famous tracking dog, Tom, to help in the search. Checking the missing sister's room for something to give the dog scent, the pastor was surprised to find her wooden rosary and book of rules, both items which nuns were obliged by their vows to always carry on their person, except upon retiring. The bloodhound picked up the scent from the book and headed straight through a cornfield in the back of the convent, into the woods beyond, and onto a road where the trail ended. Dangling from a barbed wire fence along the way was a piece of woolen yarn, 1/8 of an inch wide and 1.5 inches long. The missing nun, however, was nowhere to be found. The pastor described her as medium height, about 5'5", slender, fragile in build, having an olive complexion with dark amber eyes. Charming in manners, around her nose she had obvious enlarged pores. She wore glasses and had unusually long, bony fingers. The record at the Felician Order of Nuns read in 1907 as it does today. Sister Mary Janina, Josephine Meeson, from Chicago, Illinois, born January 24th, 1874, made apostolate September 20th, 1888. Final vows, August 25th, 1901. August 23rd, 1907, lost.
A search of the Carp Lake area, now called Lake Leelanau, and the nearby Cedar Swamp had turned up nothing. Speculations on the fate of the missing nun would persist for 11 years, until a new pastor of the Isadore Church, preparing to rebuild the structure, originally erected in 1883, received a grisly suggestion from the church elders. Best to remove the bones of the missing nun that lay buried in the church basement. The specific location was given. Under the cover of darkness, the pastor held a lantern while the church sexton used a potato fork to probe the ground. And indeed, they did discover the remains of poor Sister Mary Johns in a shallow 3-foot square grave some 18 inches below the loose cellar soil. When later questioned at the trial why he had not immediately notified the local authorities, the sexton replied, "It wasn't my place to." He did find his place to secretly rebury the bones in an unmarked grave at the foot of a cross in the center of the nearby church cemetery. The gruesome discovery might have stayed reburied had it not been for an illicit affair between the new pastor and a local farmer's 19-year-old daughter. However, his broken vows and her loose lips produced an adoption in Ann Arbor and a confession to her parents upon returning to Isadore. They lost no time informing both the church board and the local sheriff. The pastor was promptly dismissed, and as the detectives stepped in, a very natural national curiosity grew. When pressed for more information, the church elders from, of all places, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, revealed yet another lead from anonymous sources. The killer had been a woman. Sister Mary Johns of the Isadore Convent, located not far from Cedar, Michigan, in the center of the Leelanau Peninsula, had been missing for 11 long years before a mysterious church cover-up suddenly came to light. Her bones and some personal effects had been discovered down in the Isadore church cellar, hastily buried in a small, shallow, unmarked grave. Anonymous church elders from Milwaukee, hearing of plans to rebuild the old wooden church, feared scandal if workers digging a new foundation found out what, or more precisely, who was secretly buried there. The source had provided another leading insight. The killer had been a well-known woman in Isadore. Suspicion soon focused on the former pastor, and particularly upon his housekeeper, a small, thin, brown-eyed woman who spoke mostly Polish, but obviously knew more English than she let on. Police interviews with church parishioners and local residents revealed that the housekeeper had a habit of bad-mouthing the Isadore nuns, especially Sister Mary Johns, whom she accused of turning the pastor's head. In fact, over the course of the trial, many others would come forward to attest to her character assassination of the missing nun. Northern Michigan's most bizarre murder mystery began to attract national attention as an examination of the skull recovered from the church cellar by the Leelanau County coroner revealed a sickening insight. Blows to the head had rendered the victim unconscious, but had probably not been the cause of death. The body had been buried alive. Questioned by reporters at the Park Place Hotel in Traverse City, the housekeeper was evasive. "It all happened so long ago. How can I remember everything that happened?" Finally charged with the murder, her bail was set at $5,000, with bond discussions initiated with the Traverse City State Bank, who ultimately decided to have nothing to do with the matter. Her benefactor, the former pastor, was ready to put up the money mostly in Liberty bonds, when finally bail was denied. The former pastor firmly believed in his housekeeper's innocence. However, the increasing publicity was taking its toll. His sister observed, "This notoriety will kill him if it keeps up." The housekeeper was transported to and incarcerated in a small brick jailhouse that still stands in Leland today. This was to be the scene of what her defense would claim to be physical and mental torture at the hands of the local law in their zeal to obtain a confession. It was October of 1919 at the Leland Courthouse when the Polish housekeeper stood trial for the murder of the missing nun. The prosecutor's first order of business was to verify the remains found under the church as those of Sister Mary Johns. The former pastor had insisted that the bones were not hers. Newspaper readers across the country were as chilled as those in attendance as the skull, bones, and personal effects of the missing nun were carried into the courtroom.
An ex-classmate of the missing nun tearfully identified her class ring, and a blackened cord was verified as the knotted rope of her customary girdle. Another nun, visiting several months after the disappearance, had also found the unfortunate sister's wire-rimmed spectacles just inside the door of the now infamous church cellar. Then the all-male, mostly farmer jury personally examined the lacerated skull. In a last morbid move, the shoes taken from the unmarked grave were opened for the first time. To establish motive, the prosecution next led in a parade of witnesses who attested to the housekeeper's insults and insinuations aimed at the missing nun and her sisters. She called them priests' wives, and Sister Mary John's unworthy, claiming she had assailed her virtue. Throughout the cross-examination, these witnesses and their testimony would remain unshaken. Next, the state called attention to an attack of insanity displayed by the prisoner in the Leland jail. Sent to the state hospital in Ann Arbor for observation and treatment, she was observed to be shamming and was treated to a return to the Leland jail. It was during a visit to Milwaukee, the state asserted, that the housekeeper had given confession whereby the church elders had first learned of the murder and provided information that had ultimately brought the buried bones to light. Next, the prosecution's star witness was a mole, a female detective fluent in Polish and planted in the Leland jail for 6 days, had obtained a disputed confession. "I have done my penance. My sins are forgiven. Yes, I killed the sister." Against the vehement protests of the defense, it was admitted as evidence. Meanwhile, the housekeeper's legal team had a bombshell of their own. They accused the local sheriff and her jailers of mental and physical torture. When the housekeeper saw through the planted spy, they claimed she was beaten and abused. One night, she said, she was forced to lie with the nun's bones, also housed in the jail. In addition, candles burned on each side of the skull, and the jaw was made to move as a voice declared, "You killed me." After 8 hours of deliberation into the night, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree. She was sentenced to life in the Detroit House of Correction. The housekeeper replied, "I no kill Sister Janina." An appeal to the Supreme Court would change nothing. After serving 7 years as a model prisoner, she was pardoned by the governor at the request of the prison superintendent, who declared, "I have always believed her innocent." The housekeeper ironically ended up in Milwaukee, working for that same order of nuns. She lived to be 92. A surviving enigma to the case was a strange letter written to the Isadore convent less than a month after the nun's initial disappearance in 1907. It claimed that, tired of her work, she had just slipped away. The letter used good grammar, proper English, and common cliches.
Why was this thing so poisoned to so many people?
Because of the fact it happened in the church. The church took it pretty personally. It's just like you talk to people today. The question came up, which I was given information on,
Okay.
is why didn't they smell the body when it became?
Exactly.
The reason that I was told was that they're raising geese out in the side yard, and the smell of the geese overwhelmed the smell of the decaying body. Now, that's what I was told. Now, whether that's the accuracy or not.
Okay. Probably the most fascinating thing that you told me was that you have it on good authority through one of the relatives of the prosecution that one of the items one of the findings in the autopsy of the bones was dealing with the pelvic bones. Will you repeat that for me?
Well, what I was told was not brought up in the trial. Basically, it was because they just wanted it conveyed. They didn't want to get into the sensational part of the trial, of the bring sensation into it. But the pelvic bone would indicate that she was pregnant.
Pregnant. How do you react to that
There's
assertion?
really nothing to it. Not a scrap of evidence. When we first came here, as I said, I heard a lot of stories, and then we heard that pregnancy one over and over again. There's not a scrap of evidence to support it.
And they also focused on Dr. Freilich, that he was the author of the Protestant Pup Letter.
He probably was, but what his motive was, I don't know. He probably felt sorry for the. And I think he thought she had run away, and he didn't want the law hounding her. But Freilich was a very popular, upright, reputable man. He was loved all over the country, or the county, and he could not have been inconceivable that he could have been involved in anything that had to do with the nun's disappearance or murder.
Well, what I was told was that they heard rumors that a body was buried in Dr. Freiler's backyard. But when they went out to uncover the body, covered it, turned up in the wrong backyard.
Now, who was the body ever identified?
That I don't know.
I don't remember his name. He was, well, this must be 10 or 15 years ago. And I went out to see him. I wanted to see how he felt about the murder and so forth. And he volunteered the information. He thought I was a great storyteller, but I didn't get the right culprit. That Lipzinska, the housekeeper, was not the murderer. And I said, well, gee, that's funny. Who did? And he wouldn't tell me. And I got a little annoyed at that. I said, well, that's a cop-out. You've come at me with this stuff, but you aren't prepared to substantiate it. Well, he said, the church takes care of its own.
When they found the body, they found the skeleton, she'd been hit in the head. Mm-hmm. And somebody walked into the convent in the kitchen, found a meat cleaver, sort of an odd-shaped meat cleaver. They brought it out, and it indicated that it fit in perfectly into the skull.
Who do you think did it? What do you think happened?
I'm just speculating. Mm-hmm. She probably did it. But was she put up to it? That's another thing that brought up. Was she put up to doing the murder?
Anybody who reads the evidence in the transcript of the trial would come to the same conclusion. The jury was unanimous, finding her guilty. There was some speculation among the Polish people that the jury had no Polish member on it, and they thought that was a miscarriage of justice or procedure. But actually, a number of Polish men had been summoned, but they were all rejected, not by the prosecution, but by the defense.
When she was waiting trial, she spent the days in the sheriff's home. She did a lot of cooking for the family. This woman said she made the best cookies.
It was October 1919. Baseball was in its darkest hour. In Chicago, the White Sox were fixing the World Series. And at the same time, a small community in Leelanau County, Michigan, suddenly appeared in the national spotlight as an immigrant housekeeper stood trial for the murder of a missing nun. More than a decade had passed since Sister Mary Johns of the Felician Order of Nuns disappeared from her life in the church and the convent school in Isadore. Isadore still exists today, mostly as a ghost town, a crossroads, though it is still a community, for the church and the convent school are still active. In Sister Mary Johns' day, it was a bustling community, a successful community of wealthy Polish farmers. A thorough search of the surrounding area had produced no clues to the nun's disappearance. And now, 11 years later, it was 1919, and a new pastor was preparing to replace the original wooden church with this very structure. When he received a grisly suggestion from church elders, it would be best to remove the bones before construction begins. From the church hierarchy came whispered words that Sister Mary Johns was dead. Her bones were buried unmarked in the church basement. Specific directions had even been supplied, and under the cover of darkness, the pastor held a lantern as the church sexton probed the loose cellar soil with a potato fork. It struck one object, then another. Sure enough, the bones were there. What the pastor did next was unusual in itself. He reburied the bones next to that cross in the center of the church cemetery and said almost nothing. The mystery of the missing nun might have remained buried forever, except that that pastor's own illicit affair with a local woman produced all kinds of confessions, some of which reached the ears of local officials. The sheriff stepped in, went looking for the missing bones, and found them at the foot of the cross, along with other evidence that they were indeed the remains of the long-missing Sister Mary Johns. National curiosity and media attention began to grow. When pressed for more information, the church elders from, of all places, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, revealed yet another lead from anonymous sources. The killer was a woman. Suspicion soon focused on a former pastor and his Polish housekeeper, a thin, brown-eyed woman named Stanislawa Lipczynska. Local residents remembered the housekeeper often badmouthed the Isadore nuns, especially Sister Mary Johns, whom she accused of having turned the pastor's head. As Northern Michigan's trial of the century took shape, an autopsy performed by one of the area's most famous physicians revealed a sickening insight. A blow to the head had rendered the victim unconscious, but not dead. The nun had been buried alive. Sister Mary Johns of the Isadore Convent near Cedar in Leelanau County was missing 11 years before a church cover-up unraveled, leading to the discovery of her unmarked grave containing bones and personal effects. Suspicion of murder emerged from the autopsy, which revealed that the victim had received a blow to the head, was buried unconscious, and suffocated. The autopsy in this case was performed by Dr. George Freilich, the Leelanau County coroner. This is Dr. Freilich's actual buggy on display in Leelanau County's Empire Museum. And undoubtedly, the doctor rode in this buggy every day to the courthouse during that infamous trial. Dr. Freilich's autopsy established murder. The police went looking for motive, and suspicion soon focused on the former pastor's housekeeper, a Polish immigrant known locally as Stella Lipczynska. The housekeeper was calm but evasive when questioned by reporters at Traverse City's Park Place Hotel. Yet, according to the reports of the day, she was irate and anxious to badmouth the nuns, especially Sister Mary Johns. "She's turning the pastor's head," she claimed. As Northern Michigan's trial of the century opened, a parade of witnesses attested to the housekeeper's insinuations and insults aimed at the missing nun and her sisters. They acted like priest wives, she said, and of Sister Mary Johns, she is unworthy, her virtue is assailed. Strong words for the day, and seemingly enough to establish motive. Stella Lipsinska was housed in the small brick jail in Leland, the county seat. It still stands today. And it was from this very jail that some of the wildest accusations coming from this trial arose. The prosecution called a star witness and presented what they claimed to be a confession. The defense cried foul. They identified the witness as a paid police informant, housed inside the jail with Lipsinska to eavesdrop. The informant reputedly overheard the housekeeper confess to a priest who was visiting her, saying, "I have done my penance. My sins are forgiven. Yes, I killed the sister." The defense was ready to prove that conversation never happened, but all efforts were quashed and the confession was allowed to stand. The housekeeper herself feigned insanity, but was found to be shamming, to quote the official record, by doctors at the State Mental Hospital in Ann Arbor. She was returned to the jail. Later, the defense team dropped its own bombshell, accusing the sheriff and jailers of mental and physical torture. The defendant's prayer book and rosary were taken from her, and they claimed that Stella Lipsinska was forced to lie in her jail cell with the bones and the skull of the very woman she was accused of murdering. It was said that candles burned on either side of the skull, and the jaws were made to move, uttering the words in English, "You killed me." Shameful behavior if it occurred, but the sheriff and the jailers were called to the stand and denied everything. The trial went on. The jury got the decision after 5 days. Tomorrow night, we'll have the jury's verdict and what happened next, for this story doesn't end with the verdict. Enigmas remain to this day. Those who delve into it are still asking new questions about Northern Michigan's trial of the century. The trial of housekeeper Stella Lipsinska, held in Leland in the county courthouse, was in the national spotlight, featured in headlines across the country. This case had everything to attract the media's attention and rivet the reader's interest. It had murder, the burial of a body alive, a police spy, charges of torture and coercion, and even the violation of the church's seal of confession. The trial was contentious and combative. The defense used numerous preemptive challenges to seat a jury that was all male and none of Polish descent, a curious move to later observers. During the trial, the defense objected over and over to the prosecution's leading questions and verbal fishing trips. The prosecution, for its part, pushed the case hard, relying mostly on circumstantial evidence and a controversial confession. The confession was pivotal and probably determined the outcome of this trial. The defense said it never even happened. There was no verbal confession, and a written confession they claimed was coerced. The defense said that Stella Lipsinska was actually beaten by her jailers. Now, that may or may not have happened. Third-degree interrogation was more common in those times. But in any case, the court accepted the confession and allowed the trial to go on. The tension of the trial and the unfolding implications reached a fevered pitch when the prosecution took out the bones and the skull of the murdered woman and set the skull on the table with the empty eye sockets facing the defendant. In testimony, the coroner stressed that death came from asphyxiation after the nun was buried, still alive. And later, in a dispute over certain fractures, the prosecutor presented the skull with the cap sawn off to each member of the jury so that they could see the discoloration for themselves. The trial lasted just 5 days, and back then juries were expected to deliberate even through the night. And so, at 5 a.m. on Saturday morning, July 18, 1919, Stella Lipczynska was pronounced guilty and sentenced to a life of hard labor in a Michigan prison. The story doesn't end there. The verdict was appealed to the Michigan Supreme Court, which declared the trial fair and allowed the verdict to stand. However, 7 years later, Michigan's Governor Groesbeck fully pardoned Stella Lipczynska. She was a free woman. And strangely, ironically, she went to work for the Felician Order of Nuns in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the same order as Sister Mary Johns, the woman she was convicted of murdering. Stella Lipczynska went on to live to the age 92. Even though all of the principals in this story are now dead and gone, it continues to generate interest and fuel speculation even to this day. Writer-historian Larry Wakefield wrote one of the definitive reviews of the trial and the story of the missing nun. It appears in his book, Butcher's Dozen.
We came here in 1940, and soon after I came here, I heard versions of the story. And there were probably a dozen different stories, not a one of them was factual. But it's all this speculation, because it was such a unusual thing to happen in this quiet community, and one of the most famous murder cases in history to have happened in a little community of Isadore.
The story of the missing nun of Isadore and the ensuing trial of Stella Lipczynska formed the basis for a popular stage drama and will be revisited again in at least one forthcoming book. It is a story that has already outlasted all of its main characters and nearly all who have personal memories of those days. It is a story likely to continue sparking interest and speculation each time it is told.